Welcome everyone to another video in the tutorial series of using Blender. This is a very important video because we will talk about the very distinction between object mode and edit mode in Blender. Essentially, object mode and edit mode are the two main modes that you will be spending time in. And this relates to directly how you do 3D modeling because technically speaking, in object mode, you cannot change the shape of any object. So you cannot be modeling things. And before that, I have this screencast keys on, just so you can see what my key presses are. And so let's first talk about object mode. Object mode is very, very simple. You can see it's in object mode here. Do note that if you select something else, again, say the camera, there's only object mode that you can work in. If we select a mesh object, then we have a lot more modes. What object mode allows us to do is it allows us to move things around, rotate, and scale. These are the only things that object mode allows us to do with one object. This means that while we can, say, move it somewhere else, give it a particular rotation, and scale even to like a particular axis, let's just scale it with respect to its x-axis, like this. This is the extent of manipulating this object. And then that's it. We cannot add new features. We cannot put in new angles. We cannot have more faces and extrusions or other shapes if we are in object mode, because all of those are intimately related to how the vertices, edges, and faces are arranged. The other thing is that even in object mode, and we can scale it up, say right now, the X direction is scaled up to 5.736 times the normal, the typical scale. This is actually not, this is not the same as changing it and pulling it further apart in edit mode, because for object mode, all of these, you can see location, there's X, Y, Z, rotation, there's X, Y, Z, scale, there's X, Y, Z. All of these numbers are, especially for rotation and scale, they exist as a multiplier to the overall object. So, a very quick example, you don't need to follow me, but say I go in here, I select this edge, and I add a bevel. You will see that it's going along the edges in different rates, at different rates, right? For this side, it's actually going a lot slower than the longer side, well, precisely 5.736 times slower. And the reason is because this is an effect, a multiply effect based on the scaling that we did in object mode. If we have this like before, just 1 times the scale all throughout, what this should look like is that it should go at the same rate. There shouldn't be one side that is beveling a lot quicker than the other side, right? So you can see this is now like a nice even cut, whereas previously, if we have this scale at say 5 times and we add in the same thing, you notice how the cut is actually not even, right? So this is one of the fundamental differences between object mode and edit mode. And I know this might be very complicated and confusing at first, because hey, it looks like the object has changed, but this will come into play when we talk about modifiers and certain other functions as well. So do understand that in object mode, we are not actually changing the shape. We are at most pulling and scaling up one of the axes, one of the directions. Whereas in edit mode, we will be actually manipulating and changing what it looks like. So let's start a new file and let's go into edit mode and have a look. So this is object mode. Still, by default, you should be in object mode. And if we select this one of the objects and we press tab, or we go to this pull down menu, we will go into edit mode and we press tab again and we go out. Tab toggles in and out of edit mode. So in edit mode, now we can make changes to the actual shape. So let's say, again, we pull something off. We'll talk about the shortcut keys in a very short time. But let's just have a look at this. Now this shape is changed. But if we go back to object mode, notice none of these values are changed. None of these values are changed. Let's say we move the entire thing away and go back to object mode. Again, the location is still 0, 0, 0. The rotation is still 0, 0, 0 degrees. And the scale is still 1, 1, and 1. That is because these, again, are multiplicative properties for rotation and scale. For those of you who come from a science or engineering background, you might be interested in knowing a bit more. This basically are matrix multiplications that scales it up and rotates. And location is basically a transformation matrix. So what is this 0, 0, 0? These three numbers actually correspond to the object origin of this thing. So let's say I click on the light bulb. You can see there's this orange dot in between. If we click on the camera, there's this orange dot here. And if we click on this thing that we just modified very quickly, you can see this orange dot here at the world origin at 0, 0, 0. And why was it there? Because by default, if we undo a bunch of times, by default, this cube, the cube origin is at the center of the cube, and the cube is placed at the center of the entire canvas. So now in edit mode, what we did is that we chose one of the axes, one of the vertices, pulled it out. Now notice how the orange dot didn't change places. And now we select everything and move it away. Notice the orange dot is still where it was. And now this location reflects the location of the origin point of a particular object. This is very important. Because a lot of times, especially if you forgot to move from object mode to edit mode or from edit mode to object mode, this might be very confusing because if you just look at it or if you're selecting something else, you don't really know where this object is placed. Because for Blender, the origin is at the world center, whereas all of the other information are basically a pile of vertices, like individual coordinates, a collection of edges that connect between two vertices, and of course their own coordinates and rotation and direction and so on, and connecting between vertices to vertices, faces, individual faces with their own coordinates. And all of these is structured information about this modified object are packed with the overall origin of the entire object because Blender does not know what this object is. And so in object mode, because we move this thing away from its initial position inside edit mode, this object origin was not changed because the entire data packet is one object. The same applies to if we accidentally add a second cube, let's say here. Now this object has its own coordinates, right? Every vertex has its own location, every edge, every face has its own data. But if we go out to object mode, we can only select everything at once. And again, the location is still 0, 0, 0. Rotation is still 0, 0, 0 degrees. And scale is still 1, 1, and 1. So if we say move, we have to move everything at the same time. If we rotate, we have to rotate everything at the same time. If we scale, we have to scale everything at the same time, because to Blender, all of these information are one object. It's included in the same object, and all of these are multiplied on top of those information. So you can see here, this cube is actually not a cube. It's both these two individual pieces that we created accidentally inside edit mode. This is one of the most common error or mistake for beginners. So this is the meaning of object mode and edit mode. In object mode, we place objects, right? We move objects and rotate it to the right orientation and scale it up and down to fit in with other objects. So imagine if you have objects, say you have a table, a chair, and a cup, and they are all individual objects, right? You create them, maybe you downloaded the table from one people, your group mates made a chair, and you created the cup by yourselves. And all of them will have different orientations, different sizes. And when you combine them onto Blender in the same scene, you will need to put the objects at its right place. You will need to organize the scene, which consists of table, chair, and cup. And to do that, you will need to move the table to the right position, move the chair to the right position in accordance to the table, scale it, and rotate it to the right size and orientation so that the chair is not hovering and twice as big and angled weirdly at an angle in space while the table is neatly placed on the floor. That is why object mode exists. Whereas in edit mode, we are actively changing what the object looks like because we're changing the structure, we're changing the outlook, we're changing the shape of these 3D models. So in object mode, we place objects. In edit mode, we edit the shape of objects. So now let's start a new file, and we'll talk about the key commands, the shortcut keys to using Blender. In object mode, we have again three things that we can do. We can move things, we can rotate, and we can scale. Now you will see me canceling operations either by escape, just press on the escape key without left clicking because left click is confirmed, or right click, So number one, you select objects by clicking on them. This should be very, very intuitive. And you can select everything by pressing A. Not Control A, because that pulls up another menu. This is the apply menu. We'll talk about that later on. But A to select everything. And if you want to delete things, you can press, say, I select this thing. This is the light source. I press X. And it'll ask you, do you really want to delete it? Yes, just click on it, and then you will remove that object. Again, click on the camera, press X, and click, and then you'll have deleted everything. Now let's have everything back on, and so we can select all by pressing A, X to delete, and everything will be gone. Everything will be gone. Now to add objects, we do Shift A. This is the add menu, or you can do it here at the top. We have a lot of objects that we can add into it, and without getting into the specifics of each and every option, for shapes that we use in 3D modeling, we will go to Mesh Objects. So let's go to Mesh, select Cube, and we'll have a cube. It's called a mesh because essentially it is a collection of vertices, that is individual points, lines, that is edges interconnecting, and faces, individual faces. Now, all of these are structures and that are mathematically defined. It's mathematically described rather, because we know the exact location of each and every vertex, and thereby we know the exact location of each and every vertices because they connect between we know the exact location of any edges because it connects any two vertices, and we know exact positioning and orientation of different faces because it is an area enclosed by edges. And these are mathematical data. These are precise numerical data in Blender. And this structure of 3D objects, we call it a mesh. So mesh, add in. We can have curves that are defined differently. We can have various other things. Even text, we can type and add words into Blender. Further down, you'll see we can add empty. It's very useful for more advanced applications, but we'll probably will skip it for now. We can add images, which either background images or reference images. We will make use of that later on. And we can add light as well. That is the light bulb that was in the default scene. And we can add a camera as well. So this is Shift A to add in object mode. And if we select on the object, we can press G to move around. Notice how if I'm in like a slanted angle looking at this thing. When I press G and move around, all X, Y, and Z will be changing. And if I go to say the front view, press G and move around, only the X and Z coordinate are changing. Again, example, if I go to the right view, that is, I'm aligned with the x-axis and I'm looking directly on the y-z plane. If I press G, only the y and z coordinates are changing and my x coordinate remains unchanged. This is why we want to be able to snap to different viewpoints very, very quickly. Another way of doing that is to press G without left clicking to confirm. We can press X, Y, or Z to tie it in, to restrict it to move along X, Y, or Z axes. Okay, so G, I can move freely. Press X, I will be able to move along the X axis. Y, move along the Y axis, and Z, move along the Z axis. Okay. Now, very similarly, we have rotation and scale. Rotation, again, right now the rotation degrees on X, Y, and Z are constantly changing at the same time. If we snap to one view, this is the front view, and rotate, only Y and Z are changing. There are slight numerical differences here because it's digital, but essentially it's changing along one axis. We can do the same thing, R and X to rotate about the x-axis, Y to rotate about the y-axis, and Z to rotate about only the z-axis. Lastly, we have scale. If we press scale, the entire object will go up, will become bigger or smaller at the same time. We can restrict it to only scale it along the x-axis, only along the y-axis by pressing Y, or Z along the z-axis. So this is the very basic operations in object mode. Again, G for grab, this is how I remember it. And I can press G and then X, Y, or Z to move along X, Y, and Z axes. Press R for rotation, R for rotate, and X to rotate about X axis, Y to rotate about Y axis, and Z to rotate about Z axis. Lastly, S to scale. It goes up and down at the same time. X to scale about along X axis, scale S and then Y, S and then Y to scale about along the Y axis, and then Z to scale along the Z axis. This is how things work in object mode, and very similarly, we can go to edit mode, and most of the basic commands are the same. We make a selection, press G, we move it around, X to lock it into the X axis, Y to lock it into the Y axis, and Z to lock it into the Z axis. Same for rotation. We can R, it will rotate freely. Press X to snap it and rotate about X axis, Y to rotate only about Y axis, and Z to rotate about Z axis. And the same thing for scale. S, the entire thing scales up. As X to scale about along the X axis, there's no thickness here. There's no width because it is just an edge, so there's nothing here to see. S and Y to scale along Y axis, and S and Z to scale along Z axis. Again, there's no obvious results here. We can actually change it by having a slight rotation like this, so that now, let's see, hopefully this will be more obvious. And now if we select this, again, scale along x-axis, you actually see that it holds only along x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis. This is like the up and down, right? So how do I switch between selecting vertices, edges, and faces? The way I do it is by using these three buttons here: vertex mode, edge mode, and face mode. Or I can use the number row 1, 2, and 3. Number row 1, not numpad, but number row 1 goes to vertex selection. Number 2 goes to edge selection, and number 3 goes to face selection. This should be simple enough. Give some time to practice. And this is how we change the shape of 3D models. Now, we will go through some of the other commands in edit mode that are very, very frequently used and are very useful. First of all, we will talk about loop cut. Loop cut is Control R, and you will see a yellow line when you hover your mouse along some of the edges. Loop cut cuts a loop around the contour of your object. Right now, the contour is a square, so it'll give me a square cut. If I hover and I scroll up and down, I can adjust the number of cuts that I want. Let's say I want 3 cuts. Now I can press left click once, and I will have the option to move my cuts to different places along this line. And let's say if I left click again, I will confirm its placement. Like this. So Control R, let's scale in a little bit more. Control R, hover, let's say I want 2 cuts, well, let's say 4 cuts. So I scroll up to have 4 lines. By default, they are distributed evenly. Left click once, and I will have the option to adjust the positioning. Now, if I want to go back to its original initial position, I can right click and it'll snap back to its original position as shown. This allows us to have a lot more points to work with, edges to work with, and faces to work with. And this is very crucial because initially we only have a cube, and a cube only has 8 vertices. So we can only create so many shapes. Whereas right now, because we have a lot more points, edges, and faces, we can do a lot more things. For example, now I can have one of this point to move outwards. Let's say to this point, move outwards so that it's kind of like a spike, right? And I can have, say, this move downwards so that it's kind of a dip. And these are features that I can only make happen with more points and edges and faces in the 3D model. And loop cut, Ctrl R, is one of the easiest and simplest and most basic way of creating additional geometry. Now the second very important, very common operation is extruding. For people from an engineering background or with experience in other 3D modeling softwares, you may not know what this is about already. Extruding is basically pulling a vertex or an edge or a face outwards. Let's start with a face. What I do is that I select this face and I press E, and it will extrude it outwards. So now I have an extrusion in parallel with my plane, with my selection. We can do this with edges and vertices as well. Let's say I select this edge. Now an edge is just a one-dimensional line. So I press E, I extrude it, and it gives us a plane. It gives us a plane, a face, right? And lastly, if I select a vertex, which is a dimensionless point, I press E to extrude, and it will give me a line. It will give me a straight edge. So, to wrap up, we talked about object mode. And in object mode, we can move things around, X, Y, and Z, to restrict it to various axes. We can rotate, X, Y, and Z, to restrict its rotation about which axis, and scaling, X, Y, and Z, to restrict how I scale it up. These, in object mode, are multiplicative entities, multiplicative entries, that changes and affects my actual shape of the 3D model, which we do and change and manipulate in edit mode, where we can make selections. We can select vertices, edges, or faces, and we can move them around. G to move, R to rotate, S to scale. The same applies. We can press X, Y, and Z to limit its scope of movement. And we have Control R as loop cut to add in extra geometry so that we have more things to work with and can create more features and details. And after selecting something, we can press E to extrude so that we create extra geometry. This is the end of this video. We talked about object mode and edit mode, and in the next video, we will guide you through the first 3D model that you make from scratch in Blender.